Well, the fun topic for today, if they're not all fun, is urinary system. Now, the urinary system, we're going to see that there's a very intimate relationship between the urinary system and the circulatory system, and there's a really important reason why. Typically, when we think about the urinary system, we think of urine. It's like, okay, well, we're going to produce urine or pee. But why? Why do we do it? We're getting rid of a waste, definitely. But what we're trying to do is take a look at how do we control the pH, how acidic or how basic the extracellular matrix happens to be. How do we control the volume of the extracellular matrix, aka the plasmid, or the plasma, sorry, I went to genetics for a moment, in the blood. And how do we essentially overall control the composition of what's in it? We looked at what a lot of the formed elements, the blood cells do when it comes to the circulatory system. But how do we really help to maintain the extracellular matrix? How do we maintain that plasma? So I want to look at this coming at you from three different directions, which might mean 3 videos for this or 4 videos. Hopefully I will get all of my numbering right when I post these. We'll see. How I want to attack this, how I think we need to go at this in this series of videos, is begin by looking at the gross anatomy, the big anatomy. These are things that you're probably going to be a little bit more familiar with. Probably all of you have heard of the urinary bladder, kidneys, ureters, things like that. Vena cava, descending aorta. So we'll look at things that we're already familiar with. Really, this is going to be a lot of naming of structures. Then I want to be able to go microscopic. This, what you've got up here, and this is essentially an example of what our text has, or at least my version has on page 1211. This is going to be pretty straightforward, but then we have to get into the business portion of this. We have to look at the kidney. We have to open it up, and we're going to see a whole new group of anatomical structures that are going to appear. Then what we have to do is look at those structures and get even smaller into things called nephrons and juxtaglomerular apparati, but that's down the road for another video. So what I want to do is start here, work our way down, look at the details, zoom in on higher magnification with it, and then once we've done all that, tie our shoes tight and actually look at the physiology. How do we filter out the contents from the plasma? How do we decide what's good and what's bad? How do we pull off, not to use an inappropriate term, peeing away all of the nutrients, all of the good stuff, because plasma is not just about waste, it's also about carrying nutrients. So why is it that we're not urinating out the good stuff as well? And lastly, the last thing we'll hit, you're going to know when it's pretty much over this series of videos, is when we talk about micturition, or really that's a scientific term for urination. That all gets into the world of the bladder down here. How do we control it? Hopefully everyone can. So really, what's the anatomy of this? What is the feedback loops that we talk, well, our urinary bladders, we'll talk back and forth to different regions of the brain, particularly the pons, what muscles are down here, and that's the end of this whole story. So I think, like I said, when we get into physiology with loops of Henle and ascending and descending limbs, that's when I'm going to have to try and go the slowest. That's where I think I'll have the best chance of losing you. This slide right now that I've got up here, I'm not going to lose you on this. I'll just go through some of these terms and see how they all work together. As I blow up over here, it's going to start to get a little bit more wiggly. We've got a lot of different types of arteries and veins and pyramids and things like that. But the reason I wanted to start with this one is if you go online, in fact, let me take a look. I don't think our text does really a very good job of this. I think I've said that before. But what I really like about this image is not just that it shows the kidneys in these tubes called ureters, a urinary bladder, and this thing called a urethra, but it also shows that we've got the circulatory system running right through it. We can't have one without the other. This is what you see in so many cases in any type of a body system, whether it happens to be human body system or a desert mouse body system. They don't sit alone. So you can't really understand how the urinary system works without understanding the circulatory system first. So let me go over the simple parts. Kidneys, we have two. Maybe some of you were born with one. Maybe due to some type of damage or disease, you're down to one. You can make it. I know a few people that just have one kidney, and it's essentially for them, as far as I know, business as usual. This is where the urine is produced. I think I referred to this as the business portion of the urinary system just a little bit ago. So circulatory system comes in, blood comes in, the magic happens here. Not really magic, but kind of feels like it when we get there. And then we're going to have, through our nice little vena cava, we're going to have this nice controlled and clean circulatory system, the blood leave. Now we've got to get rid of the waste. However, we pulled that out. So down through the two ureters, that's where the waste, ultimately the urine, is going to be carried to and stored to the urinary bladder. And then from the urinary bladder, we all have a urethra, and that is where we will eliminate the urine from the body. One thing to point out, when we get around to the reproductive system, I'll point this out again, but if you're a female, you have a true urinary system. All of these tubes and structures are essentially designated purely for removing urine from your body. Males, not so much. We have what's called a urogenital system. And what that means is up here, it's the same as being female, but our urethra does two things. One, it carries urine to the outside of our bodies. Two, here's where the genital portion comes in, it also carries sperm outside of our bodies. So we have a combo system. But we won't worry about that now. I just want to kind of get that floating around in your head somewhere. So now let's zoom in. Let's zoom in. Let me find the mouse. And then we'll zoom into the kidney itself. And now we get busy. We get very busy. So I have to try and cut through some of this and cut down or reduce this to really what's going to be most important for us. And I want to look at this in two different ways. I want to look at, let me see how I want to do this. Let me look at the circulatory system first. And then we'll look at these weird things and all this open space. And this is where we're going. There's our ureter. That's ultimately where we want to get. Circulatory system comes in through the renal artery. Lucky for us, we know it's going to leave via the renal vein. We know where it's coming from. We know where it's going to. Now, as you're used to with the circulatory system, it starts to branch. And if you get into some real detail, a lot of these have different individual names. I want to cut right to just a couple. Right here, what we see coming up each side of these little paddle-shaped things that are called renal pyramids. We'll get to those in a couple minutes. Each one of these is referred to as either an interlobular artery or an interlobular vein. So you know the direction of blood flow in each of these. I think of these paddle-shaped structures, these things called pyramids, I kind of see them as lobes. And if I'm taking the blood flow between the lobes, that's when I get the interlobular arteries or interlobular veins, depending on the direction you're going. And then, if you take a look, we kind of take a right angle. Now we're running across the edge of these lobes, or these pyramids. And they're referred to as the arcuates. A-R-C-U-A-T-E, the arcuate vein, or the arcuate artery. So essentially, let me run it over really fast here. Blood comes in from the aorta, going to the renal artery. This subdivides and subdivides into interlobular arteries. That then gets smaller and becomes the arcuate artery. Right in here, we'll start to hit capillary beds, and then it returns. Arcuate vein, interlobular vein, renal vein, out to the vena cava. So you've done enough with circulatory system. This shouldn't seem like a very big deal. Just a couple of different terms. I mentioned that there are different types of, or different names for these veins. Some are called interlobar, not to be mistaken with interlobular. I don't want to try and split hairs in through here. So as long as we've got these down, the interlobulars, the arcuates, and the renals, we're good with blood flow. Now, there's so much other structure here that we kind of have to deal with. And these little lobes are called renal pyramids. The renal pyramids are going to get really, really, really busy on the next slide, because this is where urine is produced. This is where blood is cleaned. So what's going to happen, let me see where I've got some labeling here. There's a renal papilla, which is the end to this. So each one of our renal pyramids will terminate in a renal papilla, which is just essentially a little bump. So here's where I want to do a little transition. If you look, here's our papilla, and it drains into this opening. There's nothing here. It's the beginning of a tube that's going to go to the bladder. This little opening that shows up right outside of the papilla, it's called a calyx. And it is just an open space. This is where the urine is going to drain. Here's another minor calyx. But you see how they start to kind of merge into a bigger calyx. Down here, let me see if I've got it labeled on here. Oh, there it is. What's called a major calyx. So the major calyxes are all going to merge together, and now we end up in what is called the renal pelvis, which then drains into the ureter. So essentially we've got two things at play here. First thing I looked at is blood flow in. I erased all that stuff. How we've gone to smaller and smaller and smaller veins, capillary beds, and then back to, smaller and smaller and smaller arteries to capillaries, and then bigger and bigger and bigger veins. The flip side to this is we have all of these empty spaces. Minor calyx drains into a major calyx, which then terminates in the renal pelvis, and that drains into the ureter with wonderful urine headed to the bladder. So when it comes to some of the other terms, the cortex and the medulla, the fibrous capsules, the artwork branch of renal vein, don't worry about any of that stuff. We got more important things to get to, and it's what happens right in these pyramids. Now, focus on just one of these. What I'm going to do is I'm going to blow it up. I'm going to get all of this stuff off of this slide. We're going to switch to the next slide, and you are going to see a blown up example of one of these pyramids. Here it is. There's the pyramid. You can see a whole bunch of them here. I can see minor calyces, major calyces, renal pyramid. But look at what starts to show up. There's this mess. Not quite sure what it is until we get to the right-hand side of this slide. Here's what it is. This is called a nephron. This is where it all happens. Now we see our interlobar veins, our afferents. Here's an interlobular artery. And then we see all of these capillaries that are out here all over the place. And then we've got this weird thing called a Bowman's capsule. I'll go all through this on the next one as well. I just want you to be able to follow the flow. We're going to essentially start here. If you look, there's an artery that goes in, and then it comes out. And then there's a tube, and it's called a tubule, and it's close to the capsule, so it's called proximal. And it's all twisted and bent. And then we come out, and we have our descending loop, and then we've got an ascending loop, and a distal convoluted tubule over here. If I did that the right way on this one, that comes over to the collecting duct. The collecting duct is this, and ultimately we'll have small droplets of urine drop now into minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, ultimately into the urethra. So that's what we have to figure out next. We have to step back. I'm going to switch up to another video. I think I'm about up on my 15 minutes or so, and I want to come back to this. I want to come back to a very big example of this, and I want to watch where does water move, where does waste move, because a bizarre thing that happens is once we get to the beginning, almost all of the plasma is dumped out of the circulatory system. And then selectively with this, we have to figure out what do we pull back in. So that gets us to this point. That's gotten us through some microscopic anatomy, some gross anatomy, and I've started to hint at what we're going to be looking at for the physiology. And then ultimately, micturition, and get rid of the urine. So let me switch things up, and I will see you right back here.